Hello everyone and welcome to the Caucasus Talks podcast. My name is Yayloyan and I am happy to welcome today Sopiko Japaridze, with whom we will try to cover the Rioni protests in Georgia, also touching upon the larger socioeconomic situation and the importance of ecological protests in addressing a number of critical issues in the country. Sopiko Japaridze is the co-founder and chair of the Independent Union Solidarity Network in Georgia. She has been a labor organizer for 15 years, both in the US and Georgia, and she also writes articles relating to labor and social issues in Georgia. Sopiko is also one of the co-founders of the podcast called Reimagining Soviet Georgia. It's in the English language and is an exciting platform where moderators, together with invited guests, try to tackle different issues from the history of Soviet Georgia, re-examining it and producing critical research, including oral and written histories. So I'm very much recommending following her podcast, Reimagining Soviet Georgia, on Twitter, Spotify, and other podcast platforms. Sopiko, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much for letting me be with you on this podcast. I'm very, very happy to be here.
Sopiko, let's start with the general background of the protests. So could you tell us, please, what is happening in the Rioni Valley? When did the protests start, and who are the organizers, and what are their demands? And before you begin, I would like to add that, interestingly, our today podcast coincided with the Tbilisi Pride Day and the terrible violent consequences of it we witnessed in Georgia. And as we know, the Rioni Valley defenders made a statement regarding the Tbilisi Pride. So I would like you also to talk a bit about today's far-right attacks that took place in Tbilisi, and what was the reaction on the Rioni Valley defenders' statement?
Georgia, the last few years, and since the mega dam projects have been renewed, almost several years, I would say, has had protests in the regions against dams. Protesting dams actually has a really long history in Georgia, which started during the Soviet Union in the 80s. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting parallels today, by the way. The national movement, which later on we know ended up with Gamsakhutia and the first president of independent Georgia, sort of the national movement cut its teeth on anti-dam protests against the Soviet Union, saying that the Soviet Union was trying to build dam and destroy Georgia's beautiful nature, right? It was destructive for the whole neighborhoods, and it was supposedly neighborhood, but the whole area, and supposedly it was going to serve the Soviet interests, not Georgia's interest. Mm-hmm. And so they were actually able to very quickly, I might add, stop these protests, stop these dams. And so so-called green activism has always sort of been tied to this political activism. And since then, there's always been a tradition of green something, kind of not very strong, but some kind of green groups. And so then when Saakashvili renewed mega dam projects, there's also another wave of protests against it. And Namakhon dam kind of took off more than any other dam protest because, I don't know exactly what were the factors, but started about 6 months ago. And, these Rioni Valley defenders were camping out, stopping, trying to interfere with Enka, the Turkish company that had gotten incredible rights. It's just so many rights to extract and own or control the property in the area. So pretty much the whole entire valley was sold off in a very terrible condition, right? So the contract was very let's say, very awful in every possible way. And plus it kept secret, and then it was like parts of it were leaked. So there's a lot of confidentiality around, and like a lot of closed doors around the sale or leasing of the land, of the right to extract, or from the land to build a dam, and so on and so on. So, but then there was all these government, I think people working in the government that were leaking these documents to the public at different times. So I think the ruling party wasn't 100% on building this dam, since there were leaks coming from the government. And so the protests took off. All these regular people started joining them. So the regional people who already had experiences in Svaneti and other areas where they're fighting against dams joined them, would go there periodically, stay there. It was like a camping situation. People go and stay and leave and come back and bring more people and so on. And then a lot of Tbilisians, started going up there as well, staying for weeks. And sort of the left got heavily involved. It was the very sort of small left that is in Georgia. It's not very powerful, nor is it really coherent. And the arts community too, like artists and people who were in creative fields also would go up there. People who were into green politics as well also caught the attention of many foreigners as well who are here. So it grew because it was able to attract a very diverse kind of group. So there would be sort of these pseudo-fascists and green activists and socialists all in one space. And then when every sort of this young man who became the leader, or he was the leader of Namahon, his father is a priest, their neighbors and so on. There's a big group of leadership. But this young man, he's sort of good looking, and he became a star. And then all of a sudden he had star appeal. So people were saying he was so good looking and how great of a son he was, and sort of romanticizing him, sexualizing him, making him out to be some great hero. And so just all these people's hopes and dreams started being on this group of leadership, with their sort of diverse leadership, the mother or the older woman, the younger men, the priest father or whatever. And so it was able to be everything for everyone, right? So you can project whatever you wanted onto this movement. And that really helped it grow and sustain itself. And then they moved to Tbilisi, right? All the protests were in Kutaisi or in the regions, and attracted so many people. Even though you could hear sometimes, when they would watch lives, people they did attract, right? They would say a lot of the initial anger at this project was because it was a Turkish company. And because there's, in general, there's tons of different kinds of companies, and there's been, an American company that hasn't paid workers, and there's been, I don't know, other Georgian companies, there's plenty of them. There has been another American company, Georgian Manganese, that hasn't paid or actually polluted all this city and villages nearby. But something about it clicked for people. Some because it was Turkish, some people because it was so selling an entire valley seemed, crazy to people, right? How could you sell an entire valley? Which I also understand. And land being very integral to sort of nationalism as well, and also identity, right? So this idea of Georgian land, we've been told, there's Georgian land, Georgian language, Georgian religion is what makes people Georgian. So if you sort of take away the land, then what is Georgian anymore, right? And this also fear of this old sort of medieval fears were called in, that these sort of Turkish, Ottoman kind of thinking Ottomans were taking over and they would have all these Muslims come live there as well. And I even heard people say things like that. But they seem to be in the minority because, again, this was a wide movement. You couldn't say like, oh, this is just these people or that people. And again, that was part of the appeal because it was so diverse. So everybody brought something to it. So people brought regular people, village people, workers, like cosmopolitan activists, like, European politicians. Like everybody was sort of able to bring in, because of the wide variety of individuals involved, were able to then bring a lot of resources, right? It could just be like making videos. It could just be like connecting to politicians across the world, So that's what made this movement really strong. And so far, the leadership really was able to very, very, skillfully avoid controversy, right? They were able to sort of stay good with everyone and be this sort of good-looking guy, like his family and his friends. And then when they came to Tbilisi, like from the regions to the city, and it's very different. I don't know if anyone who's listening who didn't know Georgia, but like it's very much like either city or periphery. It's like one city, main city. Everything else is sort of looked upon as periphery. And there is an elitist, kind of classist, I don't want to say like everyone's like this, but a lot of talk, like, oh, people from villages somehow are like less educated or, are not looked upon as important as people from, say, the city. And so when they got here, I felt like most of the Tbilisians did not accept them because they looked at them as sort of these village people, like some like regional. So they were really, really classist towards them, and sort of urban centric. And then because the opposition and the government, they both were attacking the movement on grounds that this was just purely xenophobic, this movement, and nothing, they were trying to downplay the ridiculous conditions of the contract, of the lease to this company. And they were sort of downplaying the real fear that people had that they would lose their homes and flooding and seismic, areas to construction. I mean, there really is so many problems with this dam project. And so they were trying to downplay it and trying to in every way vilify these people. And almost every channel really was just vilifying them. And every channel in Georgia is, based on a political party or one person. Or say like one outlook. And so I think like they wanted to discredit it. And one of the easiest way to sort of discredit people, as in like sort of virtue signaling. I don't want to use this phrase, but it's kind of like virtue signaling, even though I would say most Georgians are actually very homophobic, because it's just a default. I mean, if you haven't really had time to like think about it or fight against certain, these like homophobia, it's just like most people, more or less maybe homophobic. They might be tolerant and may not like beat up gays, but I don't think they're also very welcoming either in Georgian spaces. And so I felt like they were trying to trip up the leadership by posing certain questions about LGBT rights. And I want to say a lot of gay and queer people were taking part in these protests and going there and staying for, days, weeks, supporting this cause. So I feel like that was a way to discredit them by asking them these questions. And knowing, because, the father's a priest, so you kind of you could just tell maybe like Christianity and, coming from the villages that would not be as sort of sophisticated in these matters. And you could trip them up and isolate them. But they actually skillfully were able to, say, actually, no, like everybody deserves their own, like their rights and so on. And then there was even a moment where right-wingers assaulted LGBT people at the protest. And so when that happened, there was like a tense moment where everyone's like, oh my God, what's going to happen now? But then the leadership came and they first sort of fumbled and said, okay, maybe just don't wear anything. Like no one's allowed to bring any flags besides Georgian flag or any kind of signs. So they were just trying to like make sure there's nobody was wearing anything different, like, LGBT flag or something or anything else. But that was looked upon as like, wait a minute, are you saying like, are you sort of going after gay people not being able to wear like, like the rainbow flag or, whatever. But then this woman, Maka, she was sort of incredible, one of the leaders. She did something that was a real breakthrough for Georgia. She said, look, at this march, one of the marches they're having, she's like, because, Tbilisi is a multi-religious city, maybe not everyone appreciates the cross. Because I forgot to mention, they also erected a cross at the site where the dam was supposed to be built. And so the cross became their big, symbol. And it could be read many ways. It could be like, oh, it's because maybe Georgian identity of Christianity and something about them destroying evil with it. Or it could be against Turkish people or Muslims. Or it could be sort of, how really religious Georgia has gotten over the last 30 years. It could be many different interpretations why that is that they use the cross. But she says, look, I'm going to put down my cross because other people might be bothered by it. She's like, maybe not everybody's an Orthodox Christian. And her move was sort of really won me and everybody else over who was not homophobic, let's say, who were pro-gay or pro, more, so you can say more or less Western rights and stuff, how they want to put it, Western rights, but human rights and so on kind of folks. Anybody who was sort of that oriented, and they really won them over by her acting everybody's sort of being concerned by these little things. And she's like, dude, I'm trying to save my home here. I care more about this valley and my home, my country, that I care about trying to force somebody into some religious ideals or identity. So she said, I'm going to put my cross aside. And that angered this right-wing father and son, the ones who were beating up and harassing gay people at the protests. So when they all went back and the protest finished and they went back to their valley to continue their protesting there, they even had this big confrontation where I feel like they bullied her, saying she doesn't really know what Christianity is, teaching her Christianity about why should she put the cross down. So I feel like the reason I'm telling you all this, maybe it's boring for some people, is that moment of what Maka did was in the last 30 years almost, right? When Christianity in the church has been associated with sort of regressive politics and sort of identity politics in a different way, right? Of this Christian, we are, religious, very narrow kind of definition of what a Georgian is, and sort of anti-gay and anti-women and so on. She put that, I feel like she put all those values, she put them up for reconfiguration. And she made it seem to a lot of liberals or leftists or atheists even that there could be another kind of Christianity in Georgia that's not dogmatic, that could be much more sort of liberation and theology, a little bit more welcoming and open for everyone, and preaches sort of much more tolerance. And so this is why I think it's so shocking that now, after few weeks later, the Rioni defenders, after sort of setting out the path for a new kind of Christianity, a new kind of unification of city people, of village people, of the Western-oriented, the Georgian cultural nationalists, all of this could be, that these people could sort of work together. I felt like she was a symbol of that. But the right wing got mad at her, the cultural right wing. And I think, this is my theory, they doubled down on their attacks on her. Not on her, but the leadership. And so when the gay pride was planned already for, years, and it's been, this planning and trying to have it every year, this happens every time, I felt like the right wing had too much to lose, because I think they consider the Rioni Valley movement as their movement, as their sort of ticket to the, their ticket to heaven or whatever, their ticket to being really strong and powerful and a force to be reckoned with. So even though the left saw the Rioni Valley Defender movement as theirs, the Greens saw it as theirs, well, everyone was seeing that this movement is theirs, right? But the right wing was even more organized and much more desperate. And I think that they didn't want to leave this, didn't want to give this movement up. And because Mak already sort of opened up this sort of tolerance and different kind of, Christianity or movement, that was very dangerous to them. And so I do think through pressure, and I don't think you have to have too much pressure, because again, they were already very much like church oriented and tied to some of their, some of the priests who are the most homophobic and leading a charge against gays. So I think it wasn't very hard. And I think that they wrote this communique a few days ago saying they were against pride, but it wasn't just like against pride, because a lot of people are against pride. Actually, I want to say now, I hope someone hears this, because most gay people in Georgia that I know of, and most people who are very active fighting for gay rights, are actually against pride. They don't want pride to happen, because they think it's sort of a superficial, they think it's sort of imperialist, because they're forcing the sort of Western model and so on. They have many critiques against it. I don't want to rehash everything, but they're sort of we don't need pride, And so this letter, if it was just against, say, pride, it might have been okay. But they went further, saying that they were against this untraditional lifestyle propaganda, saying sort of homosexuality is sort of against tradition and it's clearly bad, and that pride was propaganda and they would never condone such a thing, right? So it was a lot further than just saying the form of pride maybe was not the best. And so all these, gay and queer folks that were supporting pride, supporting Namajuan Dam protests, right, were all of a sudden put in this horrible situation where they have been taking so much heat from liberals and all the people that hated, the dam protests and who were super pro-capitalist and for destroying this valley and selling it off for pennies like they wanted to. So they were constantly trying to destabilize this, this movement by this LGBT cause. And so all the gays that were participating were constantly contradicting the simple narrative that these sort of neoliberal and right wing, and I mean right wing in the economic sense, right? They're both right wing, just different ways, was trying to undermine the Rioni Valley defenders. And because the gay people were participating, they couldn't quite do that. And so when this happened, after so many gay people took part in protecting them, for them to see such a horrific communique, and not only just communique, today the leaders came to the anti-pride protest. And that was even just really shocking, kind of incredible to be part of the group that today beat up journalists, paraded them around. If you've seen Game of Thrones, it's the crazy cult that takes over and makes the Cersei walk naked while they throw things at her. It was like something out of a film, something out of like the Inquisition, like sort of medieval. And they were like, they came to where our office is today. I went down and saw it too. It was like they were screaming obscenities, trying to be against UN. I don't even know if they know what UN is, but like they were like so aggressive, just like tons of men, like 99.9% men, just screaming, angry, like, using profanities, and then pretend that they're like pro-family, which also is funny because they're super vulgar. They had one elderly woman who was screaming at women saying, you have too many rights as a woman, like it was just so like crazy. Then they went around, like smashed up, climbed over the balcony and destroyed the rainbow flags of the Pride office, and just like really just so much hate. Like the whole city, they were just sort of running around, just destroying and harming people, To witness that was like very toxic. And then you see Facebook was filled with it too. Facebook is like another Georgia functions more on Facebook. It really exists in Facebook more than it does in real life. And the things that people were saying was just horrific, So for a lot of people, this shining movement that was like a light at the end of the tunnel of 30 years of defeats, of nothing, good coming, to see that being so quickly turn and join like, proto-fascists, right? These people who are sort of their heroes like a week ago, now they're joining them, sort of, proto-fascist right-wing groups was, I don't know, very, very, very disheartening, So a lot of people are very nihilistic right now. I'm sure it's still, I don't know what's going to happen tonight. I'm not sure what these people are doing. They're going to stay here. I don't think they're even from this Tbilisi, or there could be some of them. Yeah, but this is like sort of what Georgia happens, people change rapidly. You can't, the sort of instability is something you can always count on, that movements are very fragile. People are very fragile. They are able to turn and become very different people and go against their own interests and others in 1 second. So it's like, I think, as just a regular person who lives here, right? Not even as a labor organizer, which I am, or even like a journalist, which I also, write. Even if I didn't do any of those things, I feel like how mercurial the whole country is. You can't trust anyone, like I don't know how anyone can have a normal psyche, like how can they be emotionally healthy or be trusting or believe in the future or be optimistic about anything in these kinds of conditions.
Sopiko, thank you very much for such a detailed and insightful answer. You also mentioned the strong religious sentiments of Georgians regarding their identity, and that also you spoke about the negative attitude to the Namakhvani hydropower plant coming from both environmental concerns and the fact that this grand project is overseen by the Turkish construction company called Enka. So since the Namakhvani Dam will be constructed by the Turkish company, I would like to ask you about the impact of foreign capital on workers' conditions in Georgia. Georgia is proud of its investor-centered economy and puts many efforts into promoting the attractiveness of Georgia's business-friendly environment for foreign investors, which the political class sees as necessary for opening new jobs, reviving the economy, and etc. Although the country's economy has been going through deregulation for years, the unemployment rate continues growing, and investors are seen as these heroes who can create jobs, so the country can reduce its unemployment rate, which is officially for 2021 is 21.9%. So my question will be, how do the Georgian workers see these foreign investments flow in their country? Does it have a positive impact on their working conditions? And the second question separately will be, what was the reaction of the Turkish construction company to the Rioni Valley protests?
Yeah, that's a great question, because in very sort of ironic way today, actually started last Thursday. So during this whole Pride, and these people have been, fighting Pride participants, there's been a whole week of activities like film screening and things like that. So during this time, there's a company, a so-called foreign investment, owned by this Irish man who just told 600 of his workers that he's not able to pay their last paycheck, and let go most of them without giving the 2-month compensation that he's supposed to by law. And when asked, like, oh, so when are you going to pay? He's like very, ambiguous with his answers and so on. So these workers called us, Solidarity Network, my union, and we have been, trying to figure out how to get this man to pay his workers. 600, by the way, young, English speaking, because it's a call center, so they all have to know English. Sort of what people would say is like country's future, right? And this isn't the first example. So today we had a deadline to meet with this Irish owner of this company, but he disregarded our meeting because the laws in Georgia are so terrible. He's legally liable to do very little, and he could just not pay any of them. And he already started a second company. He could just literally abandon the first company and make a second company. And you could sue the first company, but he doesn't have any money in there, so he's not liable to give you anything, right? So there's tons of companies like this that they'll have many companies opened up because it takes 24 hours to get a company started in Georgia. And you think you work for one, they'll take, they go bankrupt, whatever assets they have, they'll just move them into a second business account, and you will not see any of them. So last year we had similar case. It was like 60 or 80 workers that were left like that because the company didn't do well or did not know how to run a business, and they went bankrupt, didn't pay them for 2 months. This is very common. Wage theft, also known as wage theft, right? Not getting paid, or not getting paid overtime, not getting paid compensation, break time, and so on, or getting your vacation. It is very common here. And so we come from the last couple of years where it's like these mini companies. I think it was a Turkish company last year. That was the last year or the year before. I'm kind of getting them confused. It was like an online casino company that did this to their workers. It was a Turkish company. This company is an Irish man's company. Frontera, Georgia, has led which is an American company, oil company, that also hasn't paid their workers for 2 years. And then there's the Georgia Manganese Company that's like mining, which owns an entire city. The government gave the entire city to them, and they have subleased areas in the villages where everybody's mining for manganese themselves, and it's like the entire town is an environmental catastrophe, right? And that's where also the Shukruti stuff comes in, because it was like mining also. Whenever there's open carrier mining, I don't know if you know the difference. There's mines that you go underneath down, and there's open carriers where you just take the mountain apart in the open, and all the explosions and so on, they damage homes. Almost all the homes in all these mining areas are have windows broken, house shakes, and so on. And things like even just the mining town, just an example of, just so you know, is we interviewed this one man once where his hand was blown up. He detonated mines, and there was the ambulance service is so small, and he waited for an ambulance for like an hour to get there. And because of since this collapse of Soviet Union, every hospital in the regions has been demolished or has a smaller ability to service. He has to go to a town like 2 hours away to even get treated, right? So this is the kind of stuff that happens in Georgia. And these are all foreign investments. And so these foreign investments are mostly like parasitic. They use old, communist Soviet infrastructure, technical equipment. They don't even buy anything new. Usually Soviet trained technicians as well, because they actually know what to do, because there's no like new learning or, the ability to actually train. Or they'll use like, these Georgian young people who have skills, who've learned languages, because everyone's forced to learn many languages to live in Georgia, like Russian, English, some Turkish even, right? And so it's very low overhead costs and very cheap to pay these workers. You pay them $200 a month, $100 a month, and they work a lot. Where you would have to pay that per day, maybe in Ireland, right? So foreign investment completely uses everything that's already available here. Government gives them every perk known to man, and they still don't pay the workers. It is like the model, already capitalist model of profit making is, of course, problematic, because profit becomes, becomes like more important than people's like safety or well-being. But here it's even, but there, like you say in the West, right? It's a longer profit, so they may like change things in sort of now. So the longer trajectory of profit is even more, say, they kind of invest in a place for like 50 years or 10 years, 20 years. In Georgia, they invest in like year, 2 years, or they think only in 1 year, 2 years. So all of their approaches are extra brutal into like maximizing profit every month, every year, and not worrying about a longer effect. And so the wages are even really, really low. And one of the reasons low wages are so low is that because most people own their homes from the Soviet Union, right? So they might be still living like 10 people or, 5 people to like 2 bedrooms or something like that, because they haven't been able to expand or buy new homes since then. But because Soviet Union gave everyone a place to live, they more or less have a place to live. And so they don't usually have to rent, even though there's, of course, tons of cases like me where I have to rent. And that keeps wages very low. In a lot of ways, the companies are like, I don't know if you know this, but like, Ronald Reagan used to call like, he made up this very derogatory term called welfare queens, supposedly these like young women that were stealing from the government, and while they had like 9 children and tons of money. And I want to say like the real welfare queens are businesses in Georgia, foreign or domestic, that put almost nothing into their workers, put nothing into the country, right? Invest nothing in humans or human capital or environment or anything like that, or education. They don't even do on-site training. They want the government to pay for that, So they're almost 100% parasitic, like worse than regular capitalists that have been, tempered through union movements and government regulations and so on. So there's almost no regulation here, and no willpower to even have regulation. It's and also on top of that, government doesn't have like unemployment insurance for workers, no minimum wage. So if you do lose your job, or you're unemployed, or you have a child, or any of those things happen, you are pretty much left on your own. Or what usually happens, right? Families. Like right now, I was talking to the workers today who are left without paychecks. And the guy told me, one of the workers said, I'm going to get kicked out of my apartment because I'm paying rent, and he has a serious sinus problem, and he was waiting for the money to get surgery for his nose so he can breathe. And now he will not be getting that money. And I couldn't reach any media today because the entire media was covering the right-wing mobs beating up gay protesters and journalists. So-called, they took down EU flags and NATO flags and so on, which is fine, but like they put up this like cross, Saint Nino's cross and stuff like on the parliament. And while they're doing all this pretending they're so against the Western, encroachment, when there's actually a Western company that has mistreated 600 young people, we couldn't actually do anything. They would never even come to any of those protests. They wouldn't do a thing to help these young people, these same right-wing mobs. And because of them, we couldn't even get media out to cover a much more important development of workers' violation.
Sopiko, and what about the reaction of the Turkish construction company to the Rioni Valley protests?
Yes, so they have been, from the beginning, Enka was very condescending to the protesters. And then the Turkish ambassador intervened. So the Georgian, the Minister of Economy, she's the one who said like, oh, this is just xenophobic against Turkish people and against like Turkish like Muslims and so on. And then I guess that gave the prompt for the Turkish ambassador to make this like really long intervention where she says that starts off with also it's interesting how she starts off with like sort of Soviet Union. We were anti-Soviet. You remember NATO? like what we have in common, like good things. We both sort of hate Russia. And then it's like this is like and pretty much was like this is xenophobic to be against this company and never really addressing the terrible conditions of contract. Also, this is where it becomes really tricky. So while we're saying, oh no, this is not actually anti-Turkish, right? Well, why is the Turkish ambassador intervening on behalf of a Turkish company, right? So it does become not just a company that bought this, Rioni Valley or leasing it, but it sort of that starts to become in people's mind, one, that the Turkish government is involved, right? Because the Turkish ambassador is protecting the Turkish company.
Thank you very much, Sopiko. And you also mentioned the Shukruti protests, which is a small scale but nevertheless an important anti-mining protest in a village on the outskirts of the Georgian mining hub of Chiatura, which is a small town in the West Georgia, 180 kilometers northwest from Tbilisi. And in this town, people started suing their lips in an extreme form of hunger strike against the mining company's destructive consequences on their lives and the village life. So one of the interesting things that you mentioned regarding the documents that were leaked by even some people from the government, which indicates that this construction project is a much more complicated issue and also shows how such important decisions affect the lives of millions of people today and the future generations, but they are being taken by narrow political class behind the closed doors. So my question will be, to what extent can we say that these two protests, the Rioni Valley protest and the Shukruti protests, are a direct reaction to that without a particular ideological basis, but indirectly opposing the spread of neoliberal tendencies? And how do you see the role of those protests organized by various segments of Georgian society in challenging and changing the political culture of secrecy in the decision-making process in Georgia?
Yes. So secrecy and lack of transparency is a long history in Georgia. has never not been any other way since the collapse of Soviet Union. The idea of democracy is so superficially understood in general, or maybe it is on purpose understood superficially. But the idea of citizen participation or people's participation or involvement or them being to be part of the, I don't know, even have meetings where they, these projects, so-called, like, any kind of big projects, right, are ever, they're never invited to like a town hall or anything like that, right? Where you be like, usually like in the US, it might not actually work quite like that, but like, say theoretically, like an example, if say a school was going to be built, they'll have like town hall meetings about the school being built, invite everyone, people have like put their name on a list, and they'll have a chance to say it, what they think about it. You can request documents and have meetings and so on. Even though it often is for show also in the US, because I've taken part in many of those things, that still gives you some kind of platform to go and speak and find out. Those kinds of things are non-existent in Georgia, or they pretend it happens, but it never happened. Some have like cynical versions, or like stakeholder, participation, or whatever that means. It's like up for so much interpretation. So the participatory part of democracy is not even thought of, really. It's like so far away from people's reality that they can actually think, like, get the exact information, find out what the contract is about, and so on. All the contracts, all the companies I have talked about, all of their contracts are secret. We even have this like, it's called like business secrets or something like that. It's like it's part of the law where you cannot actually find out what, how much money the company has, what's going on with their resources, and why it's just horrible with any kind of battle. When you have a labor dispute or any kind of dispute with a company, you never know what they actually have and what they are saying they have or they don't have. Because always, if you are asking for increase in wages, which is almost always a demand because the wages are so low, they'll always tell you, oh, we don't have any money, we're actually not making a profit. So like every business says here, right? It's like, but okay, show me then, because especially in a labor dispute, the union should actually have, and in other countries, that's what happens when you have a labor dispute. The company is liable to give you their financial records so you can review if they actually have the money to give you a raise or not. So these things are unheard of here. Almost like companies but it's private. So they understand private, right? Capitalism is understand as only like sort of radical, private, I can do whatever I want. This is my land. This is my store. So if I want to mistreat people, I can do that. I owe no one anything. It's a very radical interpretation of private property. Especially private property of things that they shouldn't be. Nobody should control an entire mountain, right? Or an entire village or entire town should not be owned by one company. It's ridiculous from the beginning. But these are these kinds of, extreme, I would say again, extreme, radical, libertarian, right-wing, capitalist or approach, really doesn't have any room for democracy. And often, again, I have to go back to Soviet Union, often how sort of Western propaganda was working for, during the Soviet Union, and how later on people in the Soviet Union understood it was it's not actually capitalism versus communism. Capitalism is an economic system versus another economic system of communism. It was democracy versus dictatorship, right? So they think that capitalism equals democracy, even though the entire, say, social democracy, all the socialists have been fighting for democracy within capitalism for 200 years. Nobody knows that here, right? So nobody understands that capitalism is inherently anti-democratic. It's actually a dictatorship of private property, right? Because if you own private property, it means you can do whatever you want. And so democracy is something else that you have to bring and fight for, is new. And so a lot of these sort of right-wingers today too, who are like this like fanatic mobs, they think democracy is capitalism that they're fighting against. And they're also looking at it as like, sort of LGBT rights is undemocratic because, most of them don't want it. I mean, yeah, sure, the majority doesn't want that. They're just being sort of forced to adopt it, like from the outside, and that's how they think of it. And so that's the way the right wing understands democracy. It's just like they're forced to do these cultural things that they're like don't want to do. And so it's up to us, I think, the left, to bring this idea of democracy, of having a place, a process, demand where people are responsible. The government is responsible to share all the plans it has, right? And it can't be like spontaneous, like how it usually is. There should be a longer process. We should demand these things. We should have all the paperwork. We should know all the risks. We should do, we need to be part of this. And then to say a few words about the sort of desperate attempts is because there's absolutely no steps from doing nothing to radical steps, right? Why this happens. Why do people sew their mouths? It's because the other steps, like having, town hall, legal mechanism, right? Inspection, whatever, all these other things, unions are actually strong, right? That are protected by law. Protests that could actually mean something, right? So all these other steps are non-existent, and there's no victorious examples where people were able to be victorious or win anything with these other kinds of methods. So yes, most people, because no one cares about them, they don't have other methods to fight because it doesn't exist, mechanisms don't exist. They go from doing nothing to sewing their mouths or starting a hunger strike, like extremists. And this doesn't actually mean that it's radical in a good sense. Like, you've tried, first writing a petition and doing this, like you sort of escalated, right? It's like an escalation to more radical tactics, like usually it is in most movements, right? It's not that. The escalation here is actually desperation that there's nothing else to do. You're not able to go farther than that. And mostly when you are asking, and I think the worst thing is the demands are always so modest compared to the extremist measures, right? They ask for, like, a couple years ago, the same thing. The Chiatura miners sewed their mouth shut as well, asking for raises and better environment conditions and so on. So you ask for these like tiny things. And by the way, I think they got 10% increase in wages. I think that's how I remember it. Last time in Chiatura, when they sewed their mouth shut and were on a hunger strike on deathbed, they got almost nothing for their troubles. So the modest demands require tremendous sacrifice, and still nothing moves forward. Because if you have to do that every single time, of course you're not going to make much progress in 10 years. So you're going to have the same problems you had 10 years ago in the same place with, like, maybe 10%, 7% increase in wages that has already become nothing with the really high inflation that you already have. You're actually going backwards because inflation is eating all of the wages all the time.
Sopiko, and in the end, I would like to hear your opinion on the prospects for the collective regional cooperation in our region. Due to the transboundary character, the ecological issues require transregional cooperation. So do you see any possibility for the grassroots cooperation between our countries on the pressing ecological or other issues?
I think it's probably would be, I would say, government, cooperation as far as businesses and so on. I see more of that potentially happening than any kind of wider movements connecting right now, because I think we're all dealing with, severe ethno-nationalism. So that often means that other, other Caucasian countries, because they can't even accept sort of gay people as Georgian, right? Like the understanding of Georgian identity is so limiting in this sort of battle of cultural battles that's happening in Georgia, and the identity struggles of what Georgia's going to look like or who's going to reign in Georgia, right? The sort of cultural conservatives or the economic conservatives, or they're both culturally and economic conservatives, So the identity of Georgia is up for grabs, and so they can't even accept Georgian people as Georgian yet. That's still in the making, let's say. And so under these conditions, I think a wider cooperation I do not see yet. I do think, at least I'm not sure what's happening in other countries, but there are these internationalist leftists who we are a few of them. We're not that many, but we are emerging and getting cohering, who I think if we had the chance to meet other people like us, we would have a lot more in common and a lot more, that we could work together. And I think for any real emancipatory idea of the region, we have to work together, the most, sort of internationalist or whatever regionalist amongst us. We must work together because we have similar problems or the same problems. And by trying to deal with them one-on-one like this, it's just less successful. So I do think, the Caucasus Talks, like your podcast, is a really good way to at least start the talks and learning and meeting each other as well. I personally always have more faith in a small group of sort of dedicated people who are willing to look past their provincial identities and move forward to a larger project. So larger, emancipatory project. So in any kind of, my vision for the future would be people who are willing to do that. And I don't care even if that we're not that many. I think it doesn't matter. Fewer but better.
Sopiko, it was a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for being with us. And I enjoyed learning about the current socioeconomic, ecological, and political issues in Georgia from you. Also, learning the perspective of working class on various issues of activists, people from rural areas. So thank you so much for being with us throughout this 1 hour. And I wish you all the best with your work and looking forward to our future meetings.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it.
And I also would like to remind those who are interested in the ecological protests in Armenia, you can watch the Caucasus Talks interview of an activist from Georgia, Tabidze, who discusses with an Armenian activist Mayranush a highly important environmental issue in Armenia regarding the initiative called Save Amusar. It's an initiative organized by both activists and locals against the exploitation of Amusar's natural resources. Thank you everyone for being with us, and if you have any questions or suggestions on the topics that you would like us to discuss, please send us all inquiries to our email caucasustalks@gmail.com or via our social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. This is it for today. Have a nice day and thank you for tuning in.